the sixth parak of Shviis, page 454 of the Mishnah Behira. We're going to read it quickly. We already read this Mishnah. To refresh our recollection, we're going to read the Mishnah and then see the Rambam and the Raavad. The Rambam and the Raavad were sent out, I believe, Sunday or Monday. So you should have that in your handouts. The parak is called Sholosh Arotzois L'Shviis. Those are the first three words of this parak. Eretz Yisrael is broken into three territories, so to speak, for the laws of Shviis. There is a difference between the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, the inherent sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, versus the halachic sanctity of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is the place that has Yerushalayim, which has the Beis HaMikdash, which has the Kodesh Kadoshim, and inside the Kodesh Kadoshim, the Even Shasiya. And as we learned in the Bereishis Shiur, the Ramban Nachmanides, in his opening commentary at the beginning to Bereishis, Tohu Vohu Choshech al Pnei Sahom, the Ramban comments that the word Bohu is the Even Shasiya. The Gemara in Yuma states that the Ribono Shel Olam began creation, so to speak, in terms of planet Earth. The starting point was the place of the Even Shasiya. Shasiya comes miloshen shesi. When a person's weaving, there's something called shesi ve'erev. There's the material, the threads that go in different directions. I myself get confused. Shesi and erev, one's going up and down, one's going side to side. But shesi is one of the threads that's used to weave. And the Even Shasiya is the place where the weaving began. So there is no doubt that Eretz Yisrael has sanctity. It's been sanctified by God as the beginning of creation. It's been sanctified by God. It has many different qualities to it that are unrelated to the inherent halachic kedusha. There's the Gemara in Tainus talks about the shefa and bracha that comes for the world, comes through, so to speak, the pipe that comes down to Eretz Yisrael. It comes to Eretz Yisrael and then it gets dispersed around the world. The world thinks that they send us their bracha and their money. The truth is they're returning the money to where it started from. The Gemara in Tainus Daf Hey tells us that the shefa that comes down to the world, rain as an example, that comes down to the world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is geyser, how much rain will come to the world, and it comes to Eretz Yisrael, and from there, the Ribono Shel Olam sets off a different piping system so that rain can go everywhere else. But the pipe itself is a pipe that comes from Shemayim down to Eretz Yisrael, and it's mashpia in Eretz Yisrael, and it continues to other parts of the world. So Eretz Yisrael is unique in its kedusha, but then there's a second issue, unique in its halachic kedusha. At what point in time is Eretz Yisrael, the Jews that live in Eretz Yisrael, required to do certain mitzvahs? And there's a whole cheshbon in the Gemara in Kedushin about which mitzvahs got triggered. As soon as Yoshua ben Nun crossed the Yarden, that split second, not everything triggered. The Gemara has a cheshbon when certain halachas trigger. With that idea that there is halacha kedusha in Eretz Yisrael, and it is triggered at some point, we are being taught in this Mishnah and in other places in Shas that the kedusha can also, the halachic kedusha, can also come to an end, although the inherent kedusha, it's God's chosen land, never ends, but halachic kedusha can come to an end. In fact, the first kedusha, the first halachic kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is when Yoshua ben Nun crossed into Eretz Yisrael with what we call the Olei Mitzrayim, those who made Aliyah from Mitzrayim. Of course, those who were 20 and older at the time of the Meraglim unfortunately died in the Midbar over 40 years. So it was a new generation that was coming into Eretz Yisrael. But again, these are called the Olei Mitzrayim. These are people, a person may have been 19 at the time of the Meraglim. He left Eretz Yisrael when he was about 18. He didn't die in the Chet HaMeraglim, and he came to Eretz Yisrael with Yoshua ben Nun. So he's an Olei Mitzrayim. He's coming to Eretz Yisrael after having left Egypt. So that's the first sanctification of Eretz Yisrael with Yoshua ben Nun and the Olei Mitzrayim. We made the cheshbon that from the time Yoshua ben Nun came into Eretz Yisrael until the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed was 850 years. From the time Yoshua ben Nun and the Jews crossed the Jordan and entered Eretz Yisrael, it took 850 years for the Beis Hamikdash to be built. We have an express pasuk in Sefer Malachim. It says that Shlomo built the first Beis Hamikdash 480 years after leaving Mitzrayim. But 480 years after leaving Mitzrayim also includes the 40 years in the desert. So 480 minus 40 is 440. 40 years in the desert, the Jews crossed the Jordan. 440 years later, they build the Beis Hamikdash. So again, we have a pasuk in Malachim that says it took that Shlomo built the first Beis Hamikdash 480 years after leaving Mitzrayim, but then they spent 40 years in the desert. So when Yoshua crosses the Jordan with the Bnei Yisrael, the Olei Mitzrayim, there's 440 years till they build the first Beis Hamikdash. The first Beis Hamikdash stood for 410 years. So 440 until it was built, 410 that it stood. That means that from the time Yoshua ben Nun entered Eretz Yisrael until the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, I may have by mistake earlier said it was built, from the time Yoshua crossed the Yarden until Shlomo built the first Beis Hamikdash is 440 years. First Beis Hamikdash stood 410 years. 440 plus 410, 850. From the time Yoshua crosses the Jordan until the Churban Beis Hamikdash Rishon, 850 years. With the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, halachic sanctity ended in Eretz Yisrael. During the 70 years of Golus Bavel, the sanctity, the halachic sanctity of Eretz Yisrael came to an end. And therefore, during those 70 years, without going into great depth, we're just going to say for our purposes, during the 70 years that Jews were in Golus Bavel, there was no Shemitah, there's no Yovel, the Jubilee year, there is Midoraisa, there's no Truma, there's no Meiser, there is no halachic sanctity to the land, and we're going to leave it at that during that 70-year period. When the Jews come back from Bavel, that's called the Olei Bavel, those who made Aliyah from Bavel. And as we know, we've spoken about many times, it wasn't a tremendous number that came back with Ezra, Nehemiah. And that Aliyah is called Aliyas Ezra, Aliyas Bavel. So we have Aliyas Olei Mitzrayim with Yoshua, Aliyas Bavel with Ezra. When Ezra comes back to Eretz Yisrael with the Jews came before Ezra, and then Ezra came later with additional Jews, and we're calling it Aliyas Bavel with Ezra. Ezra went through a process of re-sanctifying Eretz Yisrael. But he didn't re-sanctify all the area that Yoshua ben Nun had conquered. He sanctified a smaller area. Why? We're going to learn about it. It's the next few Mishnayos are incredibly and amazingly interesting about how Chazal dealt with poor people, how Chazal were concerned. We're going to probably not see this today, but how Chazal were concerned to make sure that no one leaves Eretz Yisrael. They made all kinds of takanas that deal with the laws of Shemitah to make sure Jews will not leave Eretz Yisrael even temporarily. Everybody heard that? We're going to learn in the Mishnayos that are coming up, takanas that Chazal made about Shviis to ensure that Jews would not leave Eretz Yisrael even temporarily. Okay. So to wrap up what I just said, and then read the Mishnah and then see the Rambam, the Jews leave Mitzrayim, they come into Eretz Yisrael 40 years later with Yoshua bin Nun. That's called the first halachic sanctification of Eretz Yisrael. In the Lashon of Chazal, that's called Kedusha Rishona, the first sanctification through Yoshua and the Olei Mitzrayim. With the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, that halachic sanctity ends. No Shemitah, no Yovel, no Truma, no Meiser. Again, for our simplistic needs right now. Ezra comes back with Olei Bavel. He goes through a process which we're not going to discuss. It's a Mishnah and a Gemara in Shavuos. He re-sanctifies part of Eretz Yisrael, not the full borders of Eretz Yisrael, which were never fully sanctified. We know that at the Bris Bein Absarim, Avraham Avinu was promised 10 nations, and after the Parshas Lech Lecha, read the Bris Bein Absarim, it says 10 nations I will give you, and thereafter the Torah only talks about 7, the 7 nations of Canaan. The 3 are left for Mashiach. Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Those 3 were not conquered by Yoshua, were never conquered, and they will be conquered today. But Yoshua sanctified a portion of Eretz Yisrael. With the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, the halachic sanctification ended. 70 years later or so, Ezra comes back to Eretz Yisrael with the Olei Bavel, and he goes through a process that's required by halacha, discussed in Maseches Shavuos, Daf Tes Vav, how to re-sanctify Eretz Yisrael. And he doesn't do it to all of Eretz Yisrael, he does it to a specific part of Eretz Yisrael. And that's called Kedusha Shnia. Yoshua's halachic sanctification of Eretz Yisrael is called Kedusha Rishona, and Ezra's Kedusha is called Kedusha Shnia, the second sanctification. After the Beis Hamikdash, the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, that sanctification remains in place through today. And whether today Shemitah is required to be kept in Eretz Yisrael as a biblical requirement, as Nachmanides holds, or as a rabbinic requirement, as the Rambam holds, is irrelevant for this moment to our discussion. We're talking about where Shemitah took hold. Once Ezra came back and re-sanctified Eretz Yisrael in the second halachic sanctification, Shemitah took hold only in the areas he re-sanctified for halachic sanctification. It did not take hold in the areas beyond that, which although Shemitah was kept there in the days of Yehoshua and until the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, those areas have new rules now. The only place where Shemitah took full root, again with Ezra, is the limited places that Ezra sanctified when he came back with the Olei Bavel. He didn't re-sanctify all of Eretz Yisrael for reasons that we'll learn about. The riddle that I left you with at the last shiur was the following. Why, after the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, did the halachic sanctification of Yoshua and the Olei Mitzrayim, the Kedusha Rishona, come to an end? And with the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, the Kedusha Shniya, the second halachic sanctification, through Ezra and the Olei Bavel, that didn't come to an end. The first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the halachic sanctification ended, no Shemitah, no Yovel. Whereas at the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, we say that the Kedusha remained. What is the difference between the first destruction and the second destruction? That's what we're going to see today in the Rambam and the Raavad, disagreement between them. And now we'll see the Mishnah again, page 454. Sholosh Aratzos L'Shviis. There are three different, call it, territories for the halachas of Shviis. Kol sheher chaziku olei bavel me'eretz Yisrael va'ad kaziv. Any part of Eretz Yisrael that was conquered by Yoshua bin Nun, Kol sheher chaziku olei bavel me'eretz Yisrael va'ad kaziv. All the area, all the territory that those who came from Bavel with Ezra and sanctified it in the second halachic sanctification, which is from the southern part of Eretz Yisrael. And as I said in the last year, parentheses, we're not defining right now what the south is. That is a huge machlokes where the southern border of Eretz Yisrael is. Kol she'achziku olei bavel me Eretz Yisrael v'aksiv, from the south until the north, a place called Kaziv. If you look at page 454 in the picture, it's north of Akko. According to this shita, there is a lot of shitas about Kaziv and Akko. There are shitas that hold that modern day Akko is not the same Akko that Chazal talked about. For our purposes now, we're looking at picture 454. I'm looking at picture on page 454. Akko is on the Mediterranean. Kaziv is a little bit further north on the Mediterranean. Tyre, Sidon, Sidon, these are all on the Mediterranean. This is basically the map that we see today, and we're going to accept that for now. So from southern Eretz Yisrael, parentheses, wherever that may be, until Kaziv, that's the area that was sanctified by Ezra and the Olei Bavel. And in those areas, lo ne'echal, you cannot eat from the Perish Shviis after the Biur, unless you did the mitzvah of Biur, velo nevad, and you can't work that area. In other words, the place that the Olei, Bavel, and Ezra sanctified from south until Kaziv, wherever that may be, that's the area of real Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael today. You cannot work the fields in that area from south to north to Kaziv. And if you collected fruits legally from the Shemitah fruits between south and Kaziv, and the Biur time comes, you must release the fruits for Biur, otherwise you can't eat those fruits. I remind everybody what the law of Biur is. There's a schedule. Like we gave the example, you can go into your friend's field, you can go into your own field and pick pomegranates. You can't store pomegranates. You can take enough yourself and your family for a limited time, which we'll learn about. But for example, if the day of Biur means get rid of it, like Biur Chametz, we burn it, except we're not going to burn Perish Shviis, except according to limited Rishonim. But for us, the mitzvah of Biur means, and there's a schedule, and sometime next year, the Sforim stores will have Biur schedules for the Shemitah. Let's make believe that pomegranate Biur means the 17th day of Av. On the 17th day of Av, the halacha assumes that pomegranate trees have been picked across Eretz Yisrael. There are no pomegranates left on the trees. If you have pomegranates in your house that you legally collected, and they're still in your house on the 17th day of Tammuz, you must take them out of your house and render them hefker. You must be mafker them. How do you mafker them? 3 people. We're going to get into the laws of Biur. We're going to get into the laws of Biur very quickly, and I'll mention that in a few minutes. You must take them out of your house. The reason for that is that since there's no pomegranates left for anyone to pick, remember the fruits of Shemitah are hefker for everybody. The owner can have some, everybody can walk into the field and take some, but you can't collect them for storage. Once the point comes that there's no pomegranates left in Eretz Yisrael, which you will read on your chart that you will buy next year in this farm store. Once that day comes and you still have Shviis pomegranates that you collected from a field, you must take them out of your house. Every Jew must take his pomegranates that is still in his house out of his house, be mafker them, and in a certain way, we now allow everybody again to start recollecting the pomegranates. In other words, when there's no pomegranates left on the tree for anybody to collect, it is unfair, quote unquote, for people to have stored pomegranates in their house. The point is everybody's supposed to share in the fruits of Shviis. And if you still have stored pomegranates in your house, and no one else can have pomegranates because the trees are empty from pomegranates, then anyone that has pomegranates in his house has to take them out and be mafker them. Can he then take them back after hefker? We'll see later in the Maseches that it's a machlokas. But that's the rule of Biur. Now, parenthetically, I say that b'li neder, I don't know when we're going to finish the Shiurim before Pesach, but b'li neder before Pesach, we're going to read Rav Rimon. We're going to go to the Halacha Sefer so that we can understand the mitzvah of Biur, both because we've talked about Biur several times and because it's a complicated set of halachas, and it is going to affect many mishnayos that we're going to learn later in the Maseches. So we're going to go for the first time to Rav Rimon's Sefer. He has a summary of Biur, and then he has a detailed explanation of Biur with all the modern day poskim shitas, what you need to do. And you really don't know what to do until you get your schedule chart. We will get to Rav Rimon hopefully before we finish the Shiurim on Pesach. I'd like to be able to get the halachas of Biur done by then. Okay, so the first halacha in this Mishnah is any area that was conquered. I shouldn't say conquered. We'll see why in a moment. Any area that was resettled by Ezra and those who came back with him from Bavel, that area which is South Eretz Yisrael, parentheses, we're not going to discuss right now what South is, all the way to the northern border of, all the way to Ezra's northern border of Keziv, that is Shemitah land, and full Shemitah laws are kept there. Lo ne'echal, page 455, you cannot eat fruit in that, if that was picked from that area after the Biur, unless you did the mitzvah of Biur, v'lo nevad, and you cannot work the land there. Shemitah law, the big 2 Shemitah laws, you don't work the land, and if you pick the fruit, you do Biur at the appropriate time. That area of land that your Ezra re-sanctified remains sanctified through today and cannot be worked, and at the same time, the mitzvah of Biur applies there. Maimonides rabbinically, Nachmanides biblically. Next territory. Now we go beyond Keziv, go further north, which is an area that Yoshua ben Nun and those who left Mitzrayim, they did conquer, but was not sanctified a second time by Ezra. Mikziv, flip to page 457, Mikziv, Va'ad HaNahor, Va'ad Amona, that goes from Keziv further north to Amana, and east, it's an east-west kind of thing. If you go back to page 54, you'll see Amana in the picture on page 454. It's much further north than Keziv. That's an area that Yoshua conquered, but Ezra did not re-sanctify anything north of Keziv. That area, which is called the area of Ole Mitzrayim, what is its halachic status today? Mikziv vad hanahor vad Amona ne'echal. You can eat that fruit even after the biur. The biur kedusha does not attach that fruit. So when Yud Zayin Tammuz comes and there's no pomegranates left on the trees, and in the Ezra area until Keziv, you have to do biur, and if you don't, you can't eat. If you go from Keziv up to Amana, fruits that were picked between Keziv and Amana, when the 17th day of Tammuz comes and there's no pomegranates left on a tree, you don't have to do the mitzvah of biur. Avolo never. But nevertheless, the Rabbanim were masakin, we don't work that area during Shemitah. So this becomes like a mid-ground. Whereas the area north of Keziv was not sanctified halachically for a second Kedusha by Ezra, and therefore it shouldn't have any Shemitah sanctity, Chazal imposed a mid-ground. You don't work the fields between Keziv and Amana, but the fruits that you collect that grew between Keziv and Amana, when the biur time comes, you don't have to do the mitzvah of biur. Now, the third territory, Min HaNahar, flipping to page 458, Min HaNahar ume Amona v'lifnim. The word lifnim means in, but really it means out. We're not going to go into that. The Rav talks about that. If you go further north than Amona, nechal v'nevad. So if you go to page 454, if you go even further north than Amona, there you can work fields and you don't have to keep biur. So if we go back to the introductory words in the Mishnah on page 454, Sholosh Arotzos l'Shviis. There are three territories that we need to know about for Shviis. The area that was area 1, re-sanctified for halachic purposes by Ezra, which is from southern Eretz Yisrael, parentheses, we're not going to discuss where that is, until Keziv has full Shemitah law. So anywhere between southern Eretz Yisrael and Keziv, full Shemitah law, you can't work those fields during Shemitah. And there's a rule, and the rule of biur applies in that area. If you go from Keziv to Amana, fields in that area cannot be worked, but if you collect fruit north of Keziv until Amana, you don't have to keep the mitzvah of biur. That's the second place. The third territory is area beyond Amana, and there you can work the fields and there's no mitzvah of biur. Those are the sholosh ratzos. How does that affect us? Boy, does that affect us. What is the Ramat HaGolan as an example? Between south and Keziv, or is Ramat HaGolan beyond Keziv? Well, in order to determine whether Ramat HaGolan is beyond Keziv, we need to know absolutely certainly where is this Keziv. Okay, so these things anogei us, we will get to them. As I mentioned, the first thing we're going to go through in Rav Ramon's Sefer is the halachas of biur, but we're not exactly there yet. We're going to have to finish Perek Vav. It's not a difficult Perek, the rest of Perek Vav. And we're going to learn a lot, as I mentioned, a lot about how Chazal were worried that a Jew would leave Eretz Yisrael even temporarily. And they made all kinds of rules, leniencies in Hilchos Shviis to make sure that a Jew doesn't leave Eretz Yisrael even for a little trip. And we're going to learn those Mishnayos, and when we have that picture, which deals with the beer laws, we're going to go to Rav Ramon Belineda, and I'd like to finish that area up before Pesach. Now, our riddle. Why, after the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, did the halachic sanctity leave Eretz Yisrael, so to speak? And when the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the halachic sanctity remained. Yoshua ben Nun and the Olei Mitzrayim's sanctity ended with the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. The Kedusha, the second sanctification of Ezra, even after the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, it still remains. So let's take a look at the Rambam, which was sent out not today. Today has a handout for Parsha, but was sent out previously, the one before today. It's a Rambam in Hilchos Bechira, Hilchos Beis HaBechira Perek Vav. I have to change my glasses because I'm using a small print. Okay, so the Rambam says in Hilchos Beis HaBechira Perek Vav, in Halacha Yud Aleph and Yud Beis, he's actually telling us the halachas that we get from the Gemara in Shavuos that we mentioned earlier. How do you re-sanctify cities in Eretz Yisrael? What did Ezra do? There's a halachic process. Now, did Ezra do it? There's a machlokas in the Gemara what exactly Ezra did. We're not going to go into the procedural aspect of how Ezra re-sanctified that part of Eretz Yisrael from south to Kazir. We're not going to go into that. That's a discussion in the Gemara in Shavuos, and the Rambam codifies those halachas in Halacha Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, and Yud Gimel. And in Yud Daled, the Rambam talks about Ezra. Okay. Halacha Tesvav. This is a halacha that becomes Noigeya this time of year. Whenever we get to this time of year before Pesach, people start talking about, can we bring a korban Pesach on the Har HaBayis, given the fact that there's no Beis Hamikdash. This is a serious discussion. A lot of people like to write it off because as soon as they hear the word Har HaBayis, they cringe. I don't know. Har HaBayis should make people happy. It's a Har HaBayis. It's the place of the Beis Hamikdash. It makes us sad to understand how it's being treated, but it's the Har HaBayis. Baruch Hashem, the Har HaBayis is back in Jewish hands, quote unquote. It needs to be more in Jewish hands than it is right now. But Baruch Hashem, and this is a serious discussion. How serious a discussion is it? It's not a Lublin discussion. This is a shaila that was presented and dealt with very seriously in the 1830s and the 1840s when the shaila was brought to the Chassam Sofer. And there are tshuvas in the Chassam Sofer and Rabbi Akiva Eger about whether we can bring a korban Pesach in the 1830s and 1840s when the Turks ruled Eretz Yisrael. And it was a question, if the Turks gave us permission to bring a korban Pesach, can we bring a korban Pesach? So people say, they bring a korban Pesach. Everyone's Tomei Mace. Okay, so this Tomei Mace business is the same business with the people who say you can't go to the Har HaBayis because we're Tomei Mace, which means that people that give that as an answer means they never learned a Rashi they didn't learn Rashi in Chumash. And if you don't like Rashi, Rashi's getting it from a Gemara in Psachim, and it's coming from a halacha in Rambam that we learned when we learned Masechta Midas. There is no question that someone that is Tamei Meis can go on the Har HaBayis. He can't go into the Chayil, for example, or we learned in Masechta Midas where he can't go, but on what's called Har HaBayis, a Tamei Meis can go, and Rashi from the Gemara proves that from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu walked around in the Midbar with the Atzmos Yosef. He had Yosef's bones in an aron with him. He carried it with him so that Yosef can be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Moshe kept those bones with him. Yes, Rav Tzvi Kalisher asked the question, and it became a halachic discussion. If it was not a serious discussion, the Sam Sofer would have not written about it, and Rabbi Akiva Eiger would have not written about it. So we know from the fact that Moshe lived in the Machna Leviah, and the Har HaBayis is Machna Leviah, which we learned about in Masechta Midas, we know that a Tamei Meis can go on the Har HaBayis. And that's not a problem. You have to get to the Har HaBayis. And then you have a question, how can you bring a carbon if you're Tamei? The answer is, it's a Mefurish Gemara that Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. If all of the Jewish people, or a majority of the Jewish people, are Tamei Meis, it's okay. You can bring the carbon Pesach if a majority of Jewish people are Tamei Meis. A majority of Jewish people today, if not all Jewish people, are Tamei Meis. So you're allowed to bring a carbon Pesach if you're Tamei Meis. There are a lot of all kinds of technical issues that go along with that. Who's the kohen? How do you build a mizbeach? A lot of technical issues, many of which Rabbi Akiva Eiger and the Chassam Sofer deal with, that can be answered. Some of them are highly technical that they didn't want to deal with at that time. But for when people start talking about, can you bring a Korban Pesach today? Don't shut your ears and say they're Mishagoyim. Some of them may be Mishagoyim because they don't know what they're talking about. They just want to go up to the Har HaBayis and make a world war. But when people talk about, can you bring a Korban Pesach Bizman Hazeh? The answer is, it's a serious halachic discussion, including Rabbi Akiva Eiger and the Chassam Sofer. Rambam, Hilchos Beis Habchira Perek Vav Halacha Tesvav. The Rambam, after he discusses Ezra's re-sanctification of Eretz Yisrael with the people who came back from Babel, he says, Lefichach makriven hakarbonos kulam af al pi she'ein bayis bonui. Everybody read that? I hope you all have the handout in front of you. The Rambam paskins, and it comes from a Gemara. The Rambam doesn't make things up. I say that almost every time we learn Rambam, I say, and it comes from a Gemara. And if you don't know where the Gemara is, you look at the Kesef Mishnah on the side of your Rambam, and the Kesef Mishnah will tell you where the Gemara is. The Rambam says, Lefichach makriven hakarbonos kulam afal pi she'ein bayis bonui. Therefore, a person's allowed to bring all karbonos, not just a Korban Pesach, which has a special heter. You can bring all karbonos, even if there's not a Beis Hamikdash. What you need is a mizbeach. V'oichlin kodshei kodshim b'chol ha'azara afal pi shehi chareva ve'einu mukefes b'mechitza. And Kohanim can eat kodesh kadoshim in the whole area that's known to be the Azara, even if the Azara has been destroyed. And even though it doesn't have any walls around it, and you can eat those karbonos that are called kodshim kalim, lower level kedusha, a carbon shlomim, a carbon toda, and Maisa Sheni can be eaten in the whole city of Jerusalem, even though the wall of Jerusalem is no longer standing. Why? Shakadusha Rishoina Kitsha L'Shaida V'Kitsha L'Asidla. Amazing. The Rambam just contradicted everything we said. But this is the Rambam Shita. We're going to take a look at the Rive in a minute. Remember, we used the word Kedusha Rishona. The first halachic sanctification that was done by Yoshua and those who came from Mitzrayim. The second sanctification is the sanctification done by Ezra and the Olei Bovel. This is a machlokas in the Gemara whether Yoshua's sanctification with the Olei Mitzrayim is permanent or ended with the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. Now you need to be careful here. The Rambam's going to further explain himself. The Rambam was not talking about Eretz Yisrael now. The Rambam was talking about Yerushalayim. Even though there's no wall around Yerushalayim, the city remains sanctified halachically from the time of Yoshua and the Olei Mitzrayim. Yoshua didn't conquer Yerushalayim, that was left for later for David, but we call it Olei Mitzrayim. That area called Yerushalayim, even without the wall, it's been destroyed. The area called the Azara in the Beis Hamikdash, the wall's been destroyed. It has the Kedusha Azara. All of this Kedusha remains from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. This is Jerusalem halachic Kedusha. Jerusalem and inside Jerusalem is permanent Kedusha, halachic Kedusha from the time Yoshua and the Olei Mitzrayim came there. Okay. Now in halachic Kezayin, the Rambam is going to explain to us what makes Jerusalem different from the rest of Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam now asks, "V'loma ani oimer b'mikdash v'Yerushalayim kedusha rishoyna kitchel ased lavoy, uvekedusha sha'ar Eretz Yisrael le'inyan Shviis." Right, the Rambam is talking about Shemitah, u'maisris u'kiyotzeber, and the halachas of Meiser and all other halachas similar to it. Lo kitchel ased lavoy. There was no sanctity after the Churban Bayis Rishon. So the Rambam has two different halachas here. The sanctity that the Olei Mitzrayim placed on Eretz Yisrael, the first sanctity, that never left Yerushalayim and the inner parts of Yerushalayim. Never. However, in the rest of Eretz Yisrael, outside Jerusalem, the Kedusha left after the Churban Bayis Rishon. After the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Yerushalayim remained sanctified halachically forever. Outside Yerushalayim, the rest of Eretz Yisrael lost its sanctity after the first Churban. And so outside Yerushalayim, after the first Churban, there's no Shemitah, there's no Meiser, because the first sanctification by Yoshua was only good enough until the Churban Bayis, except Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is forever. So the Rambam asks on himself, where do I get this from? This here is Rambam logic, which the Ravid will disagree with. This is pure Rambam logic. The Rambam says, the reason why Jerusalem and the Beis Hamikdash have sanctity is because the Shechina is there. The God Shechina is in Jerusalem, in the Beis Hamikdash, in that whole area. U'Shechina eina b'teila. There's no such thing as the Shechina leaves and is no longer there because of a Churban. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shechina comes to rest in a place, the fact that a goy burns down the place doesn't make the Shechina leave. The Rambam proves it. The pasuk says in Bechukosai, if Jews are not shoymu Torah mitzvahs, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will destroy the Beis Hamikdash. But it says Miktashechem, I will destroy the Mikdash. The Amru Chachamim Afal Pisha Shmumim B'Kedushasim Heim Oimdim. The Chazal tell us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, if you're not shoymu Torah mitzvahs, I will destroy the Beis Hamikdash. But it's still a Mikdash. It will be destroyed. But the Rebbeinu Shalom still used the word Mikdash, which means Yerushalayim, the Beis Hamikdash, are eternally holy with the Shechina, even after a guy burns down. That's true in Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash. Aval chiyuv haaretz b'shviis uv'maisros eina ela mipnei shuki b'shrabim. What is the kedusha that Eretz Yisrael has for halacha kedusha? Remember, we distinguish between inherent kedusha and halacha kedusha. Where does halacha kedusha come from? The Rambam says it comes from kibush Rabbim. Yoshua came inside with the Jewish people. He made an army. He conquered Eretz Yisrael. Once he conquered Eretz Yisrael, halacha kedusha triggered at different times. Therefore, the halachic kedusha was dependent on conquering. The Shechina kedusha that came to Yerushalayim was not based on conquering. It was based on God sending his Shechina there, and once he sent his Shechina there, it's done. It never leaves, and therefore Yerushalayim has sanctity forever. It has halachic sanctity. But when you're dealing with the rest of Eretz Yisrael, the sanctity comes from kibush, conquering. V'chevan shenilkacha ha'oretz midayim potel ha'kibush v'niftra min ha'torah min ma'asos u'mashvia sharei einam min Eretz Yisrael. But conquering defeats conquering. If the sanctity in the rest of Eretz Yisrael is based on Yoshua's conquering, when Goyim came and conquered it away from us, their conquering defeated our conquering. And therefore, the halachic kedusha of Eretz Yisrael came to an end with the Churban Bayis Rishon, and therefore the Rambam says, "V'chevan shenilkacha ha'oretz midayim." Once the land was taken from the Jewish people at Golus Bavel, Batel HaKibush, the conquering Kedusha came to an end. V'niftara min ha'Torah, and biblically it was now no longer chayev. Biblically there was no mitzvah of Maisa, Shviis, no Shemitah, Sharei Eina min Eretz Yisrael. It's not Eretz Yisrael anymore. In other words, the halachic sanctity of Yerushalayim is halachic sanctity because Shechina came there. And a guy burning down the walls and burning down the Beis HaMikdash doesn't change the Shechina there. So therefore, the original halachic sanctification given to the Yerushalayim, the Beis HaMikdash, over the years remains permanent forever, never changes. Shechina doesn't leave. But the Kedusha that came down to Eretz Yisrael in all the parts that were conquered by Yoshua, David, etc., that was Kedusha that came down, halachic Kedusha, because we conquered it. Well, once the conquering was taken away from us because someone else conquered it, the Kedusha, the halachic Kedusha went away from there as well, and therefore, outside Yerushalayim, there's no Meiser, there's no Shemitah, min haTorah. That answers why the first Churban ended the Kedusha outside Yerushalayim, because Kibush overcomes Kibush. Conquering overcomes conquering. But on Yerushalayim, that's Shechina. What happened in the second Beis HaMikdash? There's no conquering. We just went through Purim. We know that the Persian king Koresh gave the Jewish people permission to go back to Eretz Yisrael. And he gave them permission to start building the Beis HaMikdash. And that permission was revoked. And during the time of Achashverosh, it was remained revoked. It wasn't until Esther's son Daryavish II, Daryavish allowed the Jews, his mother was Esther, Daryavish allowed the Jews to complete the second Beis HaMikdash. So how did the second settling of Eretz Yisrael occur? How did the second Beis HaMikdash being built occur? Nobody conquered anything. The ruling forces of the world, Persia, said, go, you can go back to Eretz Yisrael, and you can build the Beis HaMikdash. So we got permission. It was given to us. We didn't conquer. So the Rambam says, V'chivan she'ola Ezra v'kidsha, when Ezra came back and sanctified Eretz Yisrael for a second time from southern Eretz Yisrael, whatever that is for now, until Keziv, lo kidsha b'kibush, he didn't conquer anything. Ezra didn't have an army. Ella b'chazaka shechaziku ba. It was through chazaka. Chazaka means they took possession. The owner of the land, quote unquote, the Persian government that controlled the land, they said, here, you may take possession. You may take possession, now it becomes mine. I got a deed for it. I didn't conquer it so that your conquering can overtake my conquering. You gave it to me. You can't be an Indian giver. You gave it to me voluntarily. I didn't take it from you so that you can take it back. You gave it to me in the days of Ezra. Therefore, Lafichach, the Rambam says, Kol mokom shechaziku ba'olei Bavel, v'niskadesh b'kedushas Ezra Hashniya. Therefore, every place that those who came back from Bavel and Ezra re-sanctified it through that special sanctification process, and that's called the second sanctification, hu makudesh hayoim. It remains sanctified for halachic purposes through today, the Rambam says, which means through today for us as well. Even if the land's taken away from us again, it's irrelevant. It was taken away from us in a way that doesn't change the fact. If someone comes and kicks you out of your house, it doesn't change the fact that it's your house. So once Ole Bavel came with Ezra, and we were given the land, we didn't conquer anything, we were given the land now is ours, and even if someone tries to take it away from us, or Chas Shalom succeeds, the sanctity is there, it remains ours. V'chayiv b'shviis, and it's chayiv to keep shmita over meiseris and to keep meiser, and this is where we get our shmita today. Again, is the shmita today from south to Kaziv biblical? That's Nachmanides. Rabbinic requirement, that's Maimonides, is a different overlay to the subject. The point that the Rambam is making here is answering the riddle. With the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, the sanctity, the halachic sanctity came to an end outside Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim's sanctity is based upon the fact that God put a Shekhinah there. A guy comes and burns the place down, Nebuch, it's not going to change the fact of the Shekhinah. Therefore, halachic sanctity remains in Yerushalayim. From the time Yoshua and the Ole Mitzrayim came, the sanctity never left. Kedusha Rishona, Kitchel, Shaitel, Osad Lovay, the Rambam says. The first sanctity is permanent forever in Yerushalayim. Outside Yerushalayim, the sanctity came because over generations, the Jews conquered Eretz Yisrael. Well, we conquered it, so it's ours. Someone reconquers it away from us, so it becomes theirs. It becomes theirs not in the sense that it's no longer Jewish property. It becomes theirs in the sense that no longer does it have the Kedusha, the halachic Kedusha. And therefore, after the Churban Bayis Rishon, there was no halachic sanctity outside Yerushalayim, and therefore there was no Shemitah, the Rambam says. But when Ezra came, and he didn't conquer anything, he didn't have an army, he was given permission to go back to Eretz Yisrael by the Persian government and to rebuild the second Beis Hamikdash. It was done with permission. We didn't take anything. Yoshua took, Ezra received. It was given to the Jewish people, and therefore once it's given, it remains ours even outside Yerushalayim. What part? From the south, wherever that is, until Kaziv, which is the part that Ezra halachically re-sanctified, that remains now Kedushas Eretz Yisrael for purposes of halacha, and the Rambam includes their Shviis. So those are the places that we keep Shviis, the places that Ezra re-sanctified the second time, from south, wherever that is, until Kaziv. In that area, you may not work the land during Shemitah, and when the beer time comes, you must take the fruit out of your house, or you can't eat it. Second, it's the first territory. Second territory, from Keziv further north to Ammona, which is a place that Yoshua conquered, but Ezra did not re-sanctify, and therefore it doesn't have halacha kedushas Eretz Yisrael. That area 2, you cannot work the land during Shemitah, but there's no mitzvah of biur there. And if the pomegranates in our example run out in the field between Keziv and Ammona on the 17th day of Tammuz, you can still eat the fruit without doing biur. If you go further north than Ammona, there's no Shemitah there at all right now. You can work the land there, and there's no mitzvah of biur either. Those are the 3 arotzos. Sholosh arotzos l'Shviis. 3 territories for Shviis. That's the Mishnah we just reviewed. Territory 1, from south to Keziv, which Ezra re-sanctified. Keziv, further north to Ammona, which is a place that Yoshua, when Yoshua conquered the land, he conquered it all the way to Ammona, but between Keziv and Ammona, Ezra did not re-sanctify. So territory 1 is south to Keziv, territory 2 is Keziv to Ammona, territory 3 is Ammona and further north. That's the Rambam Shita. As I mentioned, Bli Neder, on Sunday, we're going to take a look at the Ravid. The Ravid's right there next to the Rambam. The Ravid is really of a Nahapoichu. He turns the Rambam upside down. He completely disagrees with the Rambam to an extreme. That's the Rambam Shita. We'll see the Ravid. Okay. And again, Bli Neder, we're going to finish Perek Vav. We finish Perek Vav. We're going to go to Rav Ramon Sefer, and we're going to learn the halachas of biur. And amongst the halachas of biur are the halachas that prohibit, you're not allowed to take Perush Shvius to Chutz La'aretz. If you're a tourist comes to Eretz Yisrael, there's still such thing as people that come to Eretz Yisrael and leave Eretz Yisrael. We're gonna, as I said, we're gonna learn in the next Mishnayos all kinds of takanas Chazal made to make sure people would never leave Eretz Yisrael. They created leniencies in Hilchos Shemitah so that a Yid would not leave Eretz Yisrael even for a temporary trip. These are things that Chazal did. They're not popular to talk about today because today we live in a tourist environment. People come and go as they please, as if you come on Eretz Yisrael is you just come and go. You take 2 weeks, 3 weeks to come and go as you please. Okay. We're going to learn about that in the Mishnayos, and that also affects the halachas of biur. But you cannot, if you come to Eretz Yisrael, a person comes to Eretz Yisrael during Shemitah, and he picks some pomegranates or some olives, figs, dates, again, and they are 7th year, they blossom in the 7th year, and he goes into someone's field, who's Shomer Shemitah, and he picks them, and he says, this is really cool. I'm going to bring back some Shemitah grapes and Shemitah dates to my friends and my family in Chutz La'aretz. They'll love it. What is a chus to eat Shemitah fruit? I'm going to bring them back some Shemitah fruit. You're not allowed to take Shemitah fruit out of Eretz Yisrael. There are limited, very limited exceptions, and this has to do to a certain degree with the rules of biur. So the rules of biur are going to dovetail into the rule of not leaving Eretz Yisrael and dovetail into the rule of not taking fruits of Eretz Yisrael, of Shemitah, into Chutz La'aretz, and they'll come together in the Mishnayos that we're going to learn over the next few days. And then we're going to see Rav Ramon summarizing all these halachas in the Sefer. Okay, so Bli Neder Miat Shem Sunday, we're going to come back to the Ravid who disagrees with the Rambam. So you're going to need the Rambam still, right? The Rambam. And we're going to take a look at additional Mishnayos in Perek Vav.